I'm Bob Wilhelm, and I'm a storyteller. Today's session is about learning a story and our own preferences in learning stories between oral storytelling and written storytelling. In other words, it's a very important question every storyteller needs to be aware of, and that is, how did I, as a storyteller, first learn my stories? In a traditional society, most of those stories would have been heard orally from members of the family or from other members of the community. But with literacy, many of our stories are learned from the book. And so as we grow through the years, we of course have both influences. We hear stories from other people and we read stories. And as storytellers, we have to make decisions about how we're going to learn a story. So I have noticed over the many years that there are people who memorize stories and people who visualize stories. A memorized story means that you learn from a book, you learn from a written text because it has so shaped your life, your early life. You are literary. The words are your starting point. And your task is, as you memorize the words, because there's no other way of doing it. If you're working from a literary text, you're probably going to stay very close to the words of the story. If for many people who tell stories this way, reading a text actually creates images of words in their mind's eye. So that they see words as they are telling the story, sort of like a teleprompter. So that's one way to learn a story. And actually, in some art forms, that's a preferred way to learn a story. So, an actor, for example, learns a script. The script has to be memorized because of the art form. Uh, and unless it's improvisational theater, but if it's traditional theater, it has to be memorized. So everyone is telling the same story, and everyone knows the cues to begin and end their part of the performance. And so an actor memorizes a story traditionally, and then has to explore the story. So the words are the beginning, and then you have to access the story emotionally. In other words, you have to somehow identify with the story. You have to internalize the story. You have to make the story move from the mind into the heart. And that's a challenge, and a good actor can do that. Now, the other way is quite different. It's visualizing. People who visualize stories don't start with words. They start with pictures in their imagination, in their mind's eye. They see with their mind's eye, eyes open, they see the story events unfolding. And then they find the words to describe what they see. And the storytelling performance is finding the words that describe the pictures in the best way. So it's a different kind of a challenge, and it is the kind of storytelling we learn in oral settings. So we don't memorize stories about events in our family life. We visualize them because we see them in our mind's eye. We remember them. And every time we tell them, we will tell them differently. We have to tell it differently because the pictures have to be described. And the words that we choose to describe the picture that we see can change from time to time, depending on all kinds of reasons. So this is a challenge to storytellers. And again, you have to make a decision based on your own strengths, on your own interests, on your own way of telling stories. Now, I learned my first stories in a traditional family setting. My parents and grandparents were immigrants, and I learned storytelling before I learned to read, story listening and storytelling. So that has always been my bias, though many of the stories that I tell from written sources because there aren't, in my life, I've experienced many storytellers, but probably the majority of the stories, I know the majority of the stories I tell, I I research and I learn. And I don't memorize, but I visualize the stories. We'll talk about that later on. So I want to give an example of what happens when you visualize a story. And that's the point of this particular video. When I tell stories from people who I've heard tell stories, and I don't mean virtually on a video, but I mean face to face in a real setting, some sort of a space, a three-dimensional space with other people. This is the traditional storytelling circle. I remember the stories always in terms of that setting. Lawrence Tullock in Shetland Islands, when I went there and he told the story of John Tate and the bear, I remember standing in the parking lot. I remember looking at the island. I remember the weather of the day. I remember Lawrence's expressions, the words that he used. And when I tell that story, I actually see into the story. I'm viewing the pictures in my mind's eye, and I'm simultaneously seeing into this memory, this personal memory of Lawrence telling stories. And this has happened many, many times. So Giles Asbury, a West Virginia storyteller, many, many years ago, told me a favorite story, which is the story of Wicked John. It's an Appalachian mountain tale. And I remember the room where he sat, and I remember the tone of his voice. I remember the other people who were in the room. And when I tell the story of Wicked John, which really catches me up because it's that kind of a story, I also remember Giles. And Gioia Tempinelli also. The stories that she told of Francis of Assisi. I heard them first from her, The Wolf of Gubbio, one of my favorite stories. So I am in Gubbio, in Italy, telling the story, but I'm also remembering the outdoor setting in upstate New York 40 years ago when Gioia told that story and I was in the audience. Now, this was explained to me about a long time ago in Cambridge, England. I had organized a conference on storytelling in the early 1970s. It was at Cambridge University at the college that I had attended. And the conference on storytelling involved mostly scholars who were talking about myths and legends and so forth. But there was also one storyteller, one full-time professional storyteller who came. He came with his wife, Linda Williamson, who was presenting a paper on his storytelling. And Duncan, who was a traveler, a Scottish traveler, an itinerant, told a number of stories. But the one that I most vividly remember, it's one of my favorite stories, I have listed on my website, is the story of Jack and the Silken Purse. And Duncan explained, or Linda actually did, and then Duncan spoke about later on. Duncan explained that when he learned a story and told a story, and his repertoire was incredible, I mean, it was hundreds of stories, that one of the ways that he remembered the story, how we got into the story, and this is so important, how we entered the story was remembering the setting of the story, remembering the folks who were there, the place that it was, indoors or outdoors or whatever, and remembering the person who told the story. And I have found that is exactly what happens. So when I tell the story of Jack and the Silken Purse, Duncan Williamson is always with me. I've transposed the story in my imagination because I've lived in Western Maryland in the foothills of the Appalachians for 25 years. And it also is it's a mountain tale, it's one of those Jack stories. And so when I tell the story, though I've been to Scotland many times and told the story there, and I've told it elsewhere, but I kind of have transposed the story into into the coves of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is my home. But I still see Duncan telling the story at Cambridge University back many, many years ago at that conference. So I want to suggest, and I will end with this, want to suggest that you take stock of how you learn stories, and you take stock of what kind of storyteller you are. If you are very attached to the text and the written words, a lot of storytellers who, for example, tell stories from books, collections of folklore or children's stories or scriptural stories, if you're very, very attached to those stories, then there's a different methodology for working on the story and requires a lot of repetition, a lot of going over and over out loud, learning and going over and over and over out loud. And there's a different way of learning stories if you visualize it, because if you visualize it, then what you need to do is you need to evoke the images in your imagination. You don't rely on the text. You already know the story. You know the gist of the story. You've prepared yourself if you haven't heard it from another person. If you have heard it from another person, you don't have to do it. I mean, I don't have to prepare the stories I heard from Joya or from Giles or from Duncan. Because they're all there. They're all there in my hearing of the story. I've improvised on it, yes, but it's not in the text for me. It's in my memory based on the images. So it's a tension. It's a tension, and there are other issues. For example, how were stories? How did Homer tell stories originally? How did he memorize it? Was it written down? That's a topic for another discussion. But again, I want to suggest to you that you find the method that you enjoy the best. Most people prefer one or the other. And if you're going to learn a story, you learn the story according to a memorization and a visualization. And it results in a slightly different kind of storytelling, and there are certain things you have to do to compensate for either of the two ways of learning the story. And some of those ways are a bit of a challenge, but you can do it. You can do it. You can always do it. So I'm going to end with this. It's just a lesson on storytelling and how we learn stories. And just be aware, do I learn from a text, a written text, a script? Do I learn from images in my imagination? And when I tell the story, and we'll talk about this some other time, I will tell the story differently according to the two ways. In other words, I, as the teller, will experience the story differently if I've memorized or if I've visualized. And the listener, and this is really quite an incredible thing, actually the listener will also. The listener will know when you memorized a story and when you're primarily working from the written word. And the listener will know when you're working from images in your mind's eye. So that's a topic for another time. I'm Bob Wilhelm. Thank you for joining me.